Welcome back, everyone, to Teaching Gamers Social Skills. With me, your host, the Wise Hoopo. Today, we're going to get into the Commander part of Commander, how we play with and build around this central part of our format. Despite being the fundamental pitch for the format, I find a lot of analysis of EDH tends to leave the hallmark mechanic under-discussed. I think this highlighting of commanders as a major pillar of deck building, without the necessary caution signs about the attention they draw from your opponents, is what causes so many players to default to building decks that borderline don't function without their leaders, and go absolutely nuts if they can untap with them, creating decks with what I call a feast or famine playstyle. This is where a deck is either incredibly powerful, or doesn't do anything, depending on whether or not it gets its seminal creature. These kinds of decks can be very frustrating to play with and against, since, as opponents, your best option is to proactively disrupt the Feast or Famine player. They will outscale you if you don't. However, as the player, it feels like you're getting punished for just trying to play the game, making you feel picked on for no reason, creating bad feelings all around. I know this deck building problem isn't always caused by an overfocus on the commander, but generally, such a focus is quickly realized and thwarted by well-informed opponents, as your commander is public knowledge, and depending on its popularity, so are its best synergy pieces. Additionally, when the commander is the central engine, killing the player is the only proper answer, as removal directed towards said commander is temporary, further incentivizing this kick them while they're down mentality. Some players respond to this by building decks that are commander agnostic, allowing them to hide their deck's true game plan and fly under the radar until they can deal with the heat. I think this is a very much a throwing the baby out with the bathwater style of approach. Your commander is, and always accessible, unkillable, 8th card in hand. Such a powerful resource should be leveraged if you want to realize the full potential of the deck you're making. Instead, we should strive to synthesize this dialectic, allowing us to extract maximum value from a given commander while drawing minimal attention. To figure out how to find this equilibrium and manipulate it, we need to go into a brief discussion on the concept of politics in Commander, with a more in-depth conversation joining our endless queue of future videos. For our purposes, we're going to consider politics the gameplay patterns that emerge not from the mechanics of the game, but the multiplayer nature of Commander. When you see discussions of politics online, you often get talks of making deals and tricking opponents. I think this sets up an adversarial relationship between players, which leads to the often recurring discussions about lying in games or misrepresenting board states. Another common point of view is EDH as a D&D campaign, where we say every Commander game is like a D&D campaign, where you're all telling a story together. I think this gets closer, but I think the logic breaks down a bit in its inability to translate the player versus enemy nature of D&D to the player versus player nature of Magic. Still, we can use D&D as an example and jump off to what I think is more each game as group narrative, but with a specific twist. I like to describe this as we are all telling a story, and in my version, I win. I like this approach for a few reasons. For one, it engages with your opponents not as obstacles, but as people with their own goals that are acting in the same capacity as you, to tell the story where they win. This loops into another adage of mine. Always assume your opponents are taking game actions that make sense to them. I find that it's important to consider the people you're playing with reasonable people. Additionally, this focus on narrative draws attention to a much overlooked part of politicking, the control of information. This accumulates in a style of politics I like to refer to as polite social manipulation. This is where deal-making is not really the focus, and instead, you're trying to get your opponents to do what you want by pointing out to them that it's in their interest to do what you want. Now, this is not telling players how to play. If you do that, you will breed resentment in your group, and they will kill you out of spite. Instead, you're looking to understand their version of the game's narrative, the one where they think they're going to win in the end, and you're going to figure out how to manipulate that story to your advantage. I'm establishing all of this to tell you how I use it to keep my commanders alive until it's far too late for my opponents to deal with them. With that framework established, how do we use it to keep our commanders in play, even when they're enabling our deck to do crazy things? Well, we want to identify the reasons our opponents would be hesitant to remove our commander, and then dial them up until the point that they don't. The truth of gameplay we're trying to exploit is that targeted removal in Commander is card negative, and thus should be used sparingly. Card negative refers to how we calculate card advantage in Commander. A removal spell puts you down a card, and the opponent who cast it down a card. But the other two opponents haven't lost any cards. They're card neutral, and you are card negative. While I have opinions on how well this translates into Commander over Singleton, it's a good rhetorical trick that we can exploit. As we aren't trying to convince our opponents to never kill our commander, that wouldn't work, but rather we are trying to convince them that they can afford to wait to kill it, or that they should kill something more pressing with their limited opportunities. Our first way of doing this is by using the fact that commanders are only answered temporarily until we get more mana to cast them. In effect, this makes killing a commander even more card negative, as only the caster of the removal spell loses out on any draw. Additionally, as I pointed out in my ramp video, you can use this reality to your advantage by ramping past your commander before you cast it, thus allowing you to point out to your opponent that an answer towards your commander is meaningless, as you can just recast it on your next turn. They should instead consider killing something else more permanently. Remember, the key here is suggesting equal problems and offering friendly advice. If you insist upon it, not only will it not work, but bullying other players into doing what you want them to is just rude and should be avoided at all costs. Another thing over-ramping allows us to do is to hold up our second method, which is running more traditional protection. By running these spells, you can always feign them with open mana, or straight up show them to your opponents to convince them to deal with a less protected threat. While the obvious advantage is there to protect your game-winning board state, there's even more advantage to be had by feigning them as a tipping point to direct removal elsewhere. After all, the most powerful counterspell is one you never had to cast. This is all made even more potent if you're continuously involved and engaged with the game. If you are attentive, you can better pick up on what your opponents are worried about, and thus where you should direct them to look. Additionally, it'll be very transparent if you're just pointing out problems as soon as people are looking at your board state. Overall, this not only helps everyone keep track of their board, but it also makes you appear more consistent rather than defensive when the concept of removal comes up. Finally, try to play your commander into board states that can progress without it, or threaten immediate advantage. This opens up a variety of counterplay for you. You can point out that your advantage will continue, regardless of the removal. You can threaten retaliation with the larger board state. Or you can use your commander as bait to protect your more powerful effects that are already on the battlefield. As I covered in my Shalai deck tech, I like to have strategies weave together to support each other, and there's no difference here. If you're ramping past your commander, this gives you the openings in your curve to set up these other synergy pieces. Then, the protection you are threatening for your commander can also be used to preserve this greater board state, allowing you to use your commander as bait to pull out board wipes, and then use a protection to save your board and massively swing the game in your favor. While I think it's fair to be incredulous to any of these strategies individually as effective, it's been my experience that they combine to paint a compelling picture for your opponents to just leave your commander alone. However, this won't work if you're still building your decks to exclusively revolve around that commander. Before I get into how I avoid doing that, if you like this style of analysis, please like and subscribe. Also, if you have any thoughts, this video was inspired by a conversation I had with someone in the Discord, so come share them there. Maybe you can inspire the next one. Finally, these tricks work best if you're more focused on a fun vibe rather than winning at all costs. If you want to learn how to do that, please check out this video about how I learned how to do that. As I said, this video was inspired by a viewer talking to me about how they were traumatized by an early experience building a Magnus the Red deck that folded without its commander. They then started building decks that were commander agnostic, or use them as counterweights to the deck's weaknesses. And then they asked me how I built my decks to be able to lean so hard on commanders without getting stoned to death with removal. The line I gave them, and I want to guide you all, is to make your commanders simultaneously your ultimate synergy piece and completely unnecessary to your board. You accomplish this by understanding the powerful thing that your commander does for your deck, and then building in redundancy to that effect. Preferably, you want that redundancy to synergize with and stack on top of what your commander is already doing, allowing them to multiply each other's effectiveness. The deck I used as an example is Storvault, even with his built-in protection. The game plan I had in mind is very straightforward. I wanted to take creatures that cared about their power and use Storvault to cheat that power to a higher number than it was intended to be. While jumping a Cold Eye Selkie from 1 to 7 is quite good, if my only solution was my commander, his high mana value would never allow me to compete in bracket 3. However, green has a plethora of straightforward ways to cheat power, and in this case, 1/1 counters slotted nicely. Now, my opponents don't have the luxury to just try and wait to counter Storvault, since my creatures still grow and my game plan can threaten a lethal board state all on its own. If I do curve into Storvault though, he sets me up for some incredibly explosive turns, especially with how 1/1 counters and his trigger stack to a ridiculous extreme. In both cases, I get to have my fun, and I can easily pivot if my opponents don't fall for my earlier politicking tricks. For a less obvious example, creating a deck that doesn't need its commander to accrue its value, and only needs it to win, like my Sir Conrad deck. Nothing revolutionary here, just lots of normal black value and aristocrat stuff. But I'm doing two somewhat novel things. First, I hold off on casting Conrad until I'm prepared to win. Now obviously, this dodges removal, but it also allows me to get a lot of leeway with my other plays. Since I'm so obviously leaning on Conrad, I can sell the rest of the board as innocuous without him. This pairs well with number 2, which is my heavy focus on producing a lot of mana. Since my opponents are generally more worried about the aristocrats and mill pieces Sir Conrad is known for, these pieces get comparatively less scrutiny. This goes well with Sir Conrad as a mana sink, while more importantly giving me the resources to deploy Conrad and whatever pieces I've been sheltering in my hand, the ability to be deployed all at once, catching my opponents off guard and overwhelming them. None of this is revolutionary, but by drawing attention to Conrad as the ultimate synergy piece and playing to his reputation, I get to open up a more typical mono-black advantage plan that would have been spotted and immediately shut down in a deck like Shieldred the Whispering One. The more experienced players among you may have noticed that both these examples aren't really novel ways to build these decks. On the contrary, they're very typical. That's on purpose. I want to make sure this advice is not interpreted wrong, like a reason to hide your decks through game plan, or the fairly common sentiment that if you want your commander to be left alone, you have to play ones that no one's ever heard of. I love playing decks with weird, specific, esoteric game plans, and this strategy does work for them. But I wanted to prove that even our SpongeBob gamers can build their decks with proper redundancy. The hallmark of this strategy is to make sure that your deck has the ability to pivot somewhere else if and when your dreams go awry. After all, no plan survives contact with the enemy. I hope this helps y'all conceptualize the role your commander has to play in your decks. I really feel for people who pick up these very interesting commanders only to never untap with it because they've conditioned their playgroup to kill them on sight. If you know anyone struggling with this, please send them this video. Additionally, we touched on a lot of topics, so if you want a more in-depth follow-up, let me know. I want to help people with incorporating how they play into how they build, as it all contributes to the vibe of your Magic the Gathering games. Maybe drop in the comments how you deal with your commanders drawing too much aggro. Do you use this dual strategies approach? Maybe the counterweight commanders we talked about earlier? Or do you just stick to low mana cost commanders and double down with all the protection in the world? I can't wait to find out, and thank you for watching. By the way, happy Black Friday, everybody. I know that's going to date this video, but I felt like I should acknowledge it somewhere. It was cool to finally make a video based on a discussion with one of you guys from the Discord. So please come talk to me more. That was a really fun experience. After this, I think I'm going to go into a discussion about my opinions about the bracket system and what it's trying to accomplish. So stick around, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.